Hi folks, Chris McLean back with part 2 in my 3-part series on friction and how we can leverage friction as a mechanism to achieve our goals, to achieve our habits, to follow through with the things we want to do in life, but also for change management, behavioral change. Is something that we can use if we're just looking to change behavior, whether that's for ourselves, but also at an organizational business level. If you're looking at more systemic change, people change, behavioral change, we can use and leverage friction in various ways to make those things more likely to happen. And in the previous video, we looked at how we actually reduce friction. We can remove friction from processes to make those processes slide and move and flow a lot easier. I think that's that's a pretty common sense approach when we think of we've got a problem, we want to remove the friction so we can achieve the thing we want to achieve when we're moving towards something, moving towards a goal, moving towards some sort of behavioral change that we want to achieve, some sort of positive outcome. Today we're actually looking at a different and maybe slightly contrarian way that we can use friction. We can actually apply friction pretty much in the reverse, where we can actually add friction in to processes where we want to actually not do the behavior. So change happens in two ways. Change happens in a positive, where we want to achieve an outcome and we want to make that outcome easy to achieve. But also a lot of the times we want to remove negative behaviors. We want to change behaviors that aren't serving our new agenda, that aren't serving where we want to go. So when that's the case, the way we want to leverage friction is we actually want to build as much friction into the process as possible to stop us from repeating those pretty automatic habits. And that's really the trick with this stuff. When we do things that we want to change, we're already habituated to a process, to a habit. They are automatic. And that automatic, what that means is we get a trigger and we respond instantly. The trigger arises and we just find ourselves doing that thing. So we're so used to doing it, it's become automatic. There is no friction in that process. And that's why changing those things can be so difficult. If we look at vices like smoking, the need to have a cigarette arises, we go and have a cigarette. You look at diet, the need to grab something to eat arises, we go and grab some cookies out of the cupboard. So when we're trying to change something that's already habituated, we want to add friction in. And the lucky thing is that we're actually biologically wired to be pretty lazy. So it doesn't, as I sort of mentioned yesterday, we are biologically wired to be energy conservation systems, right? We want to expend the least amount of energy possible to get us to the thing that we want to do. So this actually works. It works a bit against us when we're trying to change something for the positive and remove that friction. But when we're actually trying to remove negative things from our lives, it actually works in our favor, that we don't actually need to add too much tension, too much friction to a process in order to make that process way less desirable and actually deter ourselves from doing it. So an example here, we can look back at I sort of mentioned cookies, right? And this is if you're inclined to eat cookies. So I get hungry, or so the trigger is hunger. The trigger could also be something like an emotion, a situation, an experience that happens, and that triggers the desire to have cookies. Where that's automated and where that's habitual, I get the trigger and I just go to the cupboard and I grab cookies and I eat them, and it satisfies that craving for a short period. That's okay until I suddenly decide that now I'm on a health kick and I'm working out and I want to get healthy and I don't want to eat cookies anymore. What a lot of people tend to do is they try to use willpower. And willpower is actually a pretty poor way to achieve it, to remove negativities, because these things are so habituated, they're so frictionless, that it's really hard to will ourselves out of doing that thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be habits, right? If it was easy not to do it, you wouldn't do it. So because they're so ingrained, we want to add friction in between those things. And something like cookies, right? The best way to solve that problem, to add friction to that process, is to not buy cookies. Rather than having them in the cupboard and having the possibility of going and doing that and trying to use will and say, well, I'm just not going to get them, I'm just not going to get them. Eventually we'll give in and we'll go and get the cookie. If they're not in the house, if we haven't bought them in the first place, then there's a whole lot of friction. So now when I get that same trigger, I've got to put my shoes on, I've got to go to the car, I've got to drive to the shop, I've got to find the cookies in the aisle, I've got to wait at the checkout, I've got to check out, I've got to get back to the car, I've got to drive all the way home, and then I get my cookies. That's a whole lot of steps just to get the cookies. So you can see there's a lot of friction points. Even if I had to walk to the shop and the shop was just down the road, I still have to do something, right? I've got to put my shoes on, I've got to walk to the shop. There's effort now involved in moving from the trigger to the response. And as I said, we're biologically wired for energy conservation. So this is where it really works in our favor. We don't need much friction to stop us from doing things that we don't want to do. But we really want to build these systems, right? We want to build these systems and mechanisms into this change process to make it easier for us to adapt, because we don't want to rely purely on willpower, because usually willpower, it's a much harder avenue. If you've, the cookies are over there and I can just go and get them, it's still possible. Whereas if I've got to go to the shop and buy them, it's way less possible and I'm less likely to enact that behavior. So this is something we see not just with cookies, at an organizational level. We see friction in things like red tape, right? We see processes where things are deliberately put in place to add friction to processes. So maybe there's things you need to check off. There's a checklist, there's a process you need to go through. So adding those steps makes it necessary and actually makes that change management process work better, right? It suits the agenda to have those things installed in that system to make it work better, to make it achieve the outcome. There's certain things that we need to achieve by the end of a process. We can build these things into the process to make sure that we're achieving the outcome that we want. So that's how we can add friction. So that's what I wanted to get into today, was how sort of the opposite end from when we want to achieve something positive. How can we use friction when we're actually trying to remove something we no longer want to do? And when that's the case, we actually want to add friction. We want to add as many steps as possible, activate, leverage that biological laziness that we have, and add friction, add steps, add processes, add things in the way of wanting to do something and then being able to do it. So it's a really good way to use friction. If you combine those two things, you're starting to have a really powerful way to achieve habits, to achieve change management, to make behavioral change easy, to facilitate change in a much more natural way, less willpower. It's much more systemized, and it means you're much more likely to achieve the outcome that you're looking to achieve. The final step we're going to look at tomorrow in part 3 is how to remove all of the other friction. So there's a whole lot of what we might call invisible friction that you may not be aware of, and that's what we're going to look at tomorrow. And you combine this 1, 2, 3 punch, you've got a really powerful mechanism, a really powerful system for decimating friction and for actually achieving the things that you want to achieve in your business and in your life. So I hope that was useful, and I'll catch you again to wind this series up on tomorrow's video. So catch you then. Thanks for tuning in. Ciao.